Good morning, everyone. Again, thank you all who came back today for day 2 of our MPO FDOT Finance Workshop. Today's going to be more of a focus on FDOT District 4. But welcome to everyone who's back again today, or if you're new here today, and also if you're joining us online today. We're going to be hearing from FDOT District 4, and we have a presentation that we'll get started with. I think everyone did introductions yesterday, so we won't do that again. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce Tony with FDOT District 4 to take it away. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Let me see here. So although we're not introducing everybody, I am going to go ahead and just introduce the teams and everybody that we've had here speaking today or yesterday. So this is our District 4 team. We've got Christine Francisca. She is the Transportation Planning Manager for District 4. Tony Norad, that's myself. I'm the MPO Liaison Supervisor. We've got Marcia Taylor. You'll be hearing from her a little bit later today. She's a Palm Beach MPO Liaison. We've got Maria Jaimes. She is the Broward and Indian River MPO Liaison. Kelly Badu, and she is the Martin and St. Lucie MPO Liaison. And then we've got Jennifer Shipley. Jennifer Shipley is the MPO Liaison Consultant Support. And then you're also going to hear today from Wabette Hay. She's the Multimodal Coordinator for District 4 as well. Yesterday, you guys did hear from Jennifer Fortunas. She is the Director of the Office of Policy Planning. Mike Neidhart, statewide MPO coordinator, and Romero Dill, who is another statewide MPO coordinator. You heard from Chris Bratton, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. He's work program analyst.
Tony, can you make sure you stand in front of the mic just for those who are online? Thank you.
And then you also heard from Dan Caston, and he is the manager of program and resource allocation. And then online, we had Erica Thompson. She's a transportation planning specialist for FHWA, and Aries Little, community planner for FTA. Okay, so before we move ahead, I just want to make sure that we point out a couple things. You will be hearing some of the same information you heard yesterday. This is done intentionally. The reason it's done is we want to make sure that, and we believe that repetition is key to retention. So you'll be hearing some of the same things again, although you'll be hearing it at a little bit more macro level, where we're going to be diving a little bit more into the weeds than the Office of Policy Planning partners did. So while we're sharing this information, it's going to be a little bit more specific to our District 4 and what are some of the best practices that we do. Your district might do it a little bit differently, and that's okay. They might ask for more information or less information. We obviously know that all MPOs are unique, and we try to do different things based on our MPO needs. Participation is critical, so ask questions. This is the opportunity that we have to share insight. So don't leave the meeting having questions and then reach out afterwards. This is, it's kind of hard to stand up here and have our team speak and not have anybody participate. So please do that if you can, if you have any questions. And then lastly, make sure that the TPA has your contact information, because we will be sending out the presentation, this one and the one from our Office of Policy Planning. So please make sure the TPA has your information so you can receive that if you'd like that. And with no further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it on to Marcia Taylor and Maria Jaimes.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? I'm Marcia Taylor Long. I'm the MPO liaison for Palm Beach, and this is Maria Jaimes. She's the MPO liaison for Broward and Indian River County. Okay, we have the slide up already. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're beginning with invoicing. When the MPOs are submitting invoices to FDOT, the department has 15 calendar days to review and process the invoice for reimbursement. This time frame is split amongst the MPO liaison unit, financial services, and central office, each having 5 days to process the invoice. In the case where an invoice is incomplete or inaccurate, Section 9H of the MPO agreement, also known as the Joint Participation Agreement, outlines required actions. If the invoice is not complete or lacks information necessary for processing, it will be returned to the MPO, and the 15 business day timeframe for processing will start over upon receipt of the resubmitted invoice by FDOT. If there is a case of a bona fide dispute, the invoice recorded in FDOT's financial system shall contain a statement of the dispute and authorize payment only in the amount not disputed. If an item is disputed and is not paid, a separate invoice could be submitted requesting reimbursement, or the disputed item or amount could be included or added to a subsequent invoice. I know that's a lot of information. Next slide. To assist with the processing of the invoice, we have special notes that we request to be added to the invoice. These are some examples on the screen. We have one for if there's incorrect rounding on the invoice, which we'll get into later on in the discussion. We have one with regards to overlapping of the invoicing dates. Again, we'll discuss that later. To assist the MPO liaisons with monitoring invoices internally, the MPO liaisons use tracking spreadsheets. The first one on the screen is the invoice tracking spreadsheet. That's the black and white picture at the top. It is used statewide by the MPO liaisons. This spreadsheet tracks the authorization of federal funds on the Joint Participation Agreement, again, JPA or MPO agreement, reflects the budget totals and the amount requested for reimbursement for each UPWP task or subtask for each invoice. It also records all UPWP revisions to the budget. As a best practice, another spreadsheet was created at our district. This was the invoice timeline tracker. That's the orange table at the bottom, which is only used, as I said, by District 4. It is maintained by the MPO liaisons to keep track of when the invoice was submitted, if they were returned for corrections, when resubmissions were done, and when the invoice reimbursement was completed. Also, the total amount of days the invoice took to process.
So just to make a comment on the second one, which is more of a district practice, that one will give us some guidance as to an average at the end of your UPWP cycle. We can get an average on how many days it took for the invoice to process from the time it was received correctly to the point where the MPO got paid. And so if we need to make any adjustments to the processing time, whether that's working with our MPOs closely to let them know, hey, these are the issues we're seeing more frequently in your invoicing, it would allow us to capture that. So it's like a quick snapshot and we don't have to go back and forth. This also aids your joint certification process as well. So we use that when we're doing our annual joint certification with our MPOs, we're gonna start using that this year, just to give us kind of like a overview of what they've done throughout the year and give them kudos for the way they've been handling their invoicing, as well as any process improvements that could be implemented to aid the processing time of their invoices, because we know the MPOs need to get paid at a timely manner. So this helps the district and the MPO work closely together to find ways to do that.
Invoices can be submitted on a monthly basis, but at a minimum quarterly. We are aware that it may be difficult, therefore it is not required, but preferred for the billing periods to be clean and uniform. That is, if the billing is done monthly, our preference is for the billing period to begin on the first of the month and end on the last day of that month. If quarterly, the billing period begins on the first day of the first month and end on the last day of the last month of the quarter. Please note that the quarters we are referring to are according to the state fiscal year. Therefore, quarter one is July 1 to September 30, quarter two is October 1 to December 31st, etc. Invoices are due to the district within 90 days after the end of the reporting period. The final invoice for the Unified Planning Work Program, UPWP, is due September 30th. If you're unable to meet the deadline for the submission, provide a written request for an extension, especially for the final invoice. As a best practice for the district, the MPO liaisons will be emailing reminders to the MPOs for the final invoice at least twice. We do it on June 30th and August 1st. Any questions? Go ahead, Alora.
So I think you answered my question, but I just want to confirm. So when you mentioned the 1st and then the 30th, that's when you're doing monthly. If you're doing quarterly, you have from obviously like say July 1 to September 30th. When we do the breakdowns for staffing expenses within that quarter, do you need the individual months to start the 1st and the 30th, or can the pay periods cross over the months within the quarter? Because what we're doing right now is we're breaking it down. Like if the pay period crosses a month, which most of them do, we'll break that pay period up into 2 sections, allocate one part to 1 month and one to another. Do we have to do that, or can we just let the pay periods flow through as long as they start on July 1 and end on September 30?
You can do exactly that.
Perfect.
Once it's within the window of your invoice. And we will speak to also overlapping just in case. We understand that sometimes your consultants or for whatever reason, the invoices come in outside of that time frame.
Mhm.
Of course, this is where the special notes would come in, where you'd advise that there's no double billing. This is outside of what was expected for the period, as long as you identify what the first date of your service in that invoice. So there's wiggle room for it. It's just our preference to have a cleaner time frame to identify the quarters.
Okay, great. And that shaves off a little bit of time for us, so that's good. Thanks.
Any other questions? Next slide, please. So recommendations for ease of processing and timely reimbursement are no rapid fire invoices or amendments. We ask that the MPOs submit invoices and amendments one at a time. A revision and an invoice can't be submitted at the same time. The MPO must either submit a revision and wait for it to be processed before submitting the invoice, or they may submit the invoice first for processing and then the revision. That is if the revision does not apply to the tasks being requested for a reimbursement. No charges outside of the billing period. For each invoice submitted, all tasks requested for reimbursement and supporting documentation should be dated within the beginning and ending date of that invoice. So what to do if the billing, say for a consultant, is outside of the billing period? You'd adjust your time frame for your beginning date and your ending date, and you'd put the special note advising that the date of this invoice overlaps with the previous invoice. However, this is not a double billing. This was charges that were not previously billed. Also, for the progress report that's to be submitted, you'd also have to adjust the progress report date and information according to whatever adjustments you've made to your supporting documentation and the invoice sheet. No charges outside of the joint participation agreement, that's your JPA term. The agreement begins July 1st and ends 2 years later on June 30th. Billing should be for services rendered within the time frame. The final invoice for services within the time frame may be submitted up to 90 days after the June 30th date to facilitate the closing out of that agreement. Go ahead, Christine.
Marcia, could you clarify the charges outside of the joint participation agreement, how that also affects the UPWP? Meaning if an MPO wants to amend or modify the UPWP, that UPWP, I'll say, is dies at the end of that 2-year agreement. So can you speak a little bit about the timing of any modifications or amendments to the UPWP related to the 2-year time frame?
I'll do my best.
Thank you.
So, okay, if you say we're in our current UPWP, which is going to be expiring June 30th, if you have any work that's being done within that time frame, you can bill against it right up to September 30th, but it has to be up to the last day, which is June 30th. Anything outside of that, you may need to consider it being part of your new UPWP if you're anticipating that your contract is going to extend past that time frame. So you may need to either consider doing a modification or amendment to the current one to accommodate whatever changes, or you may need to consider when you're now preparing come January 1 for your new UPWP, if some of these tasks need to be in the new UPWP. I'm not sure if that answered it. Okay. Any other questions? The rounding thresholds. We're aware that there can be issues with calculations in some of the softwares used, and that can cause the numbers to be incorrectly rounded up or down. Please be advised that if it is found in the invoice, it may be rejected, as these little 1 cent increases or decreases can add up over time. If you're unable to correct the erroneous rounding, the MPOs may add a note with regards to this, as mentioned in the special notes slide of the presentation. And again, we'll be providing a copy of the presentation. The invoice package. The invoice package should include the following: the invoice summary sheet. The invoice summarizes all the FHWA reimbursable expenditures incurred over the service period by the UPWP task and by fund type, and includes essential contract information. The invoice also includes a request for payment certification, which is required by 2 CFR 200.415, which must be signed by an authorized MPO official. The itemized expenditure detail report. There's no template required, but there's one available if needed. So you can request from your respective MPO liaison. And it should reflect the deliverables provided during the invoice period. It must be in alignment with that invoice period. It must be itemized by the task, FHWA funding source. So if it's PL, SU, GFSU, whatever funding types you have, you should ensure that it's on the invoice expenditure detail sheet. Expenditure category, that is if it's personnel services, consultant services, travel, other direct expenses, and it should have a running budget total. It must match the UPWP estimated budget detail, and it should be detailed enough to be reviewed for allowability of costs at the time of reimbursement. Last required document that we submit to financial services is the progress report. Also, there is no template for that, but it should use FHWA progress report standards. And also, it must align with the UPWP tasks, evidence the minimum performance standards were met as provided in the UPWP, and it also should be on a monthly or quarterly alignment with the invoice period. Any additional documentation may be required to be submitted at the time of the invoice as determined by your respective district MPO liaison.
With that being said, so those supporting documentations are maybe travel expenses. Let's say your MPO does quite a bit of traveling for conferences, which is normal. We just have to make sure we review that. So if we just ask for that, we ask that our MPOs work with us to get us that documentation. And then sometimes our district financial services will do random audits. So we might ask you, hey, they're doing an audit on invoice number 4. Please give us all your supporting and backup documents. That even includes your timesheets, anything associated with other direct expenses or anything that is being reimbursed in that invoice. So those are instances where we might ask for additional documentation. It's not that we're trying to give anybody a hard time. We just want to make sure that all expenses are allowable and reasonable, so.
So for the invoice summary sheet, we have the format. And we'll have a screenshot on the next slide. First expectation is the MPO's name, contact information, which includes the address and phone number and fax number. You want to also include your district's contact information, the invoice number using the following formats. So it should be FHWA, what the agreement number is, and the invoice number. So as the example shows, we have FHWA-G, whatever your contract number is, and 01 or 2. Should include the invoice period, that's your begin date and your end date. Again, the contract number, which includes the amendment number or modification number, the amount due by financial project number, and a listing of the tasks in the UPWP. So the UPWP revisions, or that's the amendments or modification numbers, are tracked on the invoice cover page. If there is a revision that includes an amendment and modification, that revision will be counted as an amendment for the tracking purposes. The number of amendments and modifications should equal the number of revisions submitted. And you'll see that on the next slide. Any questions?
I got a question real quick, and I'm sorry, it's more for Mike and Romero. When you're processing an amendment and there's a couple modifications as well that you need to do, you could lump it all into the amendment and just do one revision, correct? Or do you have to do 2 revisions, one for the modification and one for the amendment?
Mike? Romero? Mike,
Test, thank you. So one, if they're all for the same project, then that would be yes. But if you're dealing with different multiple projects with different funding sources, then you need to do a separate revision form for each project that has a different funding source.
Okay, yeah, so I guess what I'm saying, and I think that answer it is, if I have an amendment for one item that meets the amendment qualifications, but then I've got a couple other modifications on other little things, other tasks or whatever, it would have to be 2 separate revisions.
If it's dealing with the same funding source, it's fine. But if it's a different funding source, you need to put it on a separate revision form.
Okay, thank you.
Romero, if I could I just
Yes.
confirm? So you're saying the different form, which I call it the purple forms, purple
Yes.
pages, different there, but it's all packaged into one
Yes.
revision. So that numbering thing up there where it says amendment number 1, modification number 4, and then
No, on B1. Yeah, it'll be on one. So only time it would change, if you have like you have an amendment plus modifications on it, you have different tasks, you're modifying 2, 3, or 4 other tasks. And the first amendment is you're changing money, but it's all the same funding source, that's fine. But if you need to do something with a different funding source, then that needs to be on a separate revision form.
Gotcha.
but it's all packaged into one. At one submission.
Can 2 revision forms be part of one amendment package?
So for example, I think what Christine is trying to say, let's say our MPO has PL and SU funds, and the PL is an amendment, but then the SU, it's modification. Yes, we fill out the forms separately, meaning they have a form for the PL budget changes and then another form for the SU budget changes, but then we package it as one revision.
Yeah, I would just make sure you make Federal Highway aware that they need to be approving 2 forms. Yeah, in the email, that's all. But yes, you can package that as one, as long as you're clear that you have 2 that need to be reviewed. Yes, but it can be packaged as one package.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
and also I'm aware that some of the MPOs may have adjusted the form, so they'll have a line separate saying revision. That's where you need to ensure whatever you put for the revision. Say in this example, we have an amendment and modification 1 and 4. Make sure the revision number says 5 to cover the overall revisions. The table on the invoice summary sheet has the following information: the amount due by UPWP task and by fund type, the amount of FHWA funds due by UPWP task, the amount of previous payments for FHWA funds by UPWP task, the amount of FHWA funds budgeted by task in the UPWP. It has the column totals, as well as the request for payment certification, which is to be signed by the authorized MPO official and reflect the location of the supporting documentation, whether it's at FDOT or at the MPO. The invoicing supporting documentation. This should be detailed enough to be reviewed for allowability of costs at the time of reimbursement. It must be maintained for each item being reimbursed. That's direct costs, which is invoicing for actual costs incurred, and detailed paid supporting documentation must be maintained and available for audit. For the indirect cost rate, it must be supported with an approved indirect cost allocation plan. With regards to the review, payment, and return of invoices, the district MPO liaison follows the steps outlined in the district MPO liaison invoice review checklist prior to submitting to the Financial Services Office. FDOT does not prescribe a specific format for preparing an itemized expenditure detail report. However, it should reflect the period of service, be itemized by UPWP task, funding source, and expenditure line items. If the remaining balance for any task goes negative, the MPO shall revise the UPWP to address the negative balance. If an invoice period overlaps a previous invoice timeframe, add verbiage stating services were not submitted for payment previously and that there is no overlap in the billing.
So just to clarify, when it comes to the remaining balance going negative and we're in the middle of processing your invoice, right? And we notice, okay, that task is negative. We can't reimburse if you don't have budget allocated to that specific task. So if it's negative, even if it's by 20 cents, we can't reimburse that 20 cents or, we can't really submit for that. So that's might be a case where you might have to do a UPWP modification to move money between subtasks and make sure you have enough money on that budget or enough budget on that specific task in order to be able to process it. So what does that mean? That might mean that we might have to stop reviewing the invoice, or we might have to take that cost that you're trying to get reimbursement for and then remove it and probably invoice it on the next one so we can process the rest of the invoice. So any changes, it might trigger a couple things. So just be aware of that when you are sending us the invoice, if you do see that one of your tasks, you're going to end up negative and you want to process the invoice, I would suggest, hey, let's hold on charging that task. Let's submit the invoice for the other expenses, get that process, and then we can work on a UPWP modification. We don't want to hold up the MPO getting paid just for maybe 20 cents or 5 cents. So just something to kind of keep an eye on. I don't know if you guys have any questions or clarifications needed.
I have a question on the second bullet point, the last few words, the expenditure line items. What is, I guess, the minimum requirements for that section there? Do you require, all invoice numbers, like obviously the service period, but what are the minimum requirements for the expenditure line items? Which bullet point were you saying? The second bullet point, last couple words.
So you're asking if it includes the invoice number for that specific expenditure line?
So yeah, for instance, right now we're providing the vendor name, what the vendor does for us, the service period, the invoice number, the amount. What are, I guess, the minimum requirements for that specifically to break that down?
I would say as long as you have the name of the charge that you're asking reimbursement for, the service period, definitely it's a minimum requirement because you want to make sure you're within your invoice period. And then the amount that you're asking reimbursement for. The invoice number could be added if you want, just so you can keep track of it, but it's also part of your backup documentation. We're just asking at least for those three things to be answered.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So is there if you are negative on one task and you have to move funds from one task to the other, is that a modification or an amendment? And is there a threshold in moving money from one task to the other?
There is a threshold. We do have a document that we could provide that explains the different requirements for what an amendment is, and everything else that doesn't fall in that requirement would be considered a modification. I believe if off the top, yes, it's a technical memo, and off the top of my head, it is if you are moving anything that's about 50% of the amount budgeted for that task would be considered an amendment. Anything
Not a
under
dollar amount.
not
It's a
dollar.
percentage wise. Okay.
Percentage. If you're completely deleting a task, then that's definitely an amendment. It's, again.
As long as you're below 50%.
Correct.
For that one revision or change, but
when you're doing it for a task or a subtask.
thank you.
Go ahead.
Good morning, folks. I thought yesterday when we spoke about this, it was 10% or $100,000.
So there's two different, go ahead. There. Yeah, I believe there's two different types, so I may have mixed it up. My apologies. I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah, yes, 10% or $100,000.
There's another one, isn't there, with the 50%?
What is the percent amendment referring to if you said there's two amendment types?
Right.
If we're talking about the 10%, that's like, for example, if the task is $500 and it changes by 10%. Also, 10% seems a little low. I thought it was like 20% or more. Then it would be a an amendment if it's like above a certain percentage. We'll get clarification on the percentage amount and get back to you guys. But if it's above that certain percentage and dollar amount, then it's an amendment. But if it's below that threshold, then it will just be a modification, which we'll get more into UPWP amendments and modifications later on. And then we'll have an answer as to the percentage. We'll try to look that up. Christine?
If I could just comment. So what we've heard in the past from FHWA, and I'll say not current FHWA folks, but previous FHWA folks, their concern is if money is moving, why? What does that mean? Does that mean you're changing the scope on your deliverables, on your task? So when we see big monies moving, it's, well, why? Are you not going to do that work anymore? Are you changing your scope? Are you adding scope? Are you removing scope? So if you can try to keep that in mind, the why are you moving things? If it's just because you thought you needed this much money, you needed a little more, that's one thing. If it's big wholesale changes, the direction we were given from FHWA in the past is, well, what does that mean? So keep that in mind. And then my opinion is just, we're trying to put these thresholds on it to just make it more clear. But these are just that, thresholds. They're not written in stone. These are things that, our liaisons have to use their best judgment. And, our liaisons are really good at really knowing what their MPOs need, what they want, what they're trying to do, and then trying to get that information to FHWA so that the process can be approved. So I would just say keep that in mind, as you're making these changes.
And then a clarification for what we were asking for the amendment when you're transferring between tasks and subtasks, it's an amendment is required if a combined amount equal or greater than $100,000 or 10%. So that's where that 10% was coming from. And yes, there was an amount too.
And the 50% is when you're reducing the budget of the task or cannot be accomplished as it was originally approved. That's where the 50% comes in.
Which all of that's in the MPO handbook in chapter 3.
And it's also the one that's most restrictive, correct? Either the 10% or the 100,000.
Correct.
In clarification, 10% of the total budget, so
For that task.
10% of the total budget for that task.
Task or subtask, yes.
And it's only for that funding source, or like all federal funds for that, when we say total budget?
It would be like if
So PL versus SU. So I mean,
it's for both. If it's in your UPWP, it's still whether the funding source is PL or SU, the threshold still remains. So if it's 10% and you're moving it between PL, like you're moving from task 1 to task 2, and you're just moving 10% total.
total of both combined PL and SU. Okay.
Right.
Correct. Both.
We have a hand raised online as well.
Go ahead.
Good morning. This is Laura Carter with Space Coast TPO. I had a question regarding a UPWP modification related to when a task runs out of funds. For an example, salary and benefits. And you are processing an invoice, and these are on reimbursement. So say the invoice is for the month of September, and you're working on the invoice in late October, early November. A modification being processed at that time, I have been told, wouldn't fix the problem of going negative because the date of the modification is going to be November 1st, yet my invoice is for September that I need to submit that ran out of money. How are we supposed to, especially towards the end of the year when we're moving monies around in smaller amounts to accommodate actual expenditure of funds, can we process a modification to satisfy a budget that is after the time frame when the task goes negatives? Because we don't have the financing system that allows us to track it day to day.
I'm going to try to make sure I'm understanding the question first before I give an answer. So you're saying that you're currently reviewing an invoice for September and realize that the task, it's going to be negative.
Correct.
So you're asking if you could process a modification after the fact to fix that.
Correct.
Yes, you can. Because once an invoice is, if you've already processed the invoice, there's no way to go back to financial services and say, hey, never mind, scratch that, kind of to put it in Latin terms. So you would have to make sure that it's fixed for your next invoice period, because we can't make changes to an invoice that's already been processed and reimbursed. So the moment you find out that your task is going negative, that's when we advise you to do the modification. And keep in mind, sometimes you might want to get reimbursed. That's why we say, hey, just, you have to choose as the MPO. We can give you guidance, but at the end of the day, it's the MPO's choice as to whether they want to process the modification first or the invoice first. So if we're currently reviewing the invoice and you notice that your task is going negative and you want to make sure that this invoice is reflected correctly, you might say, hey, just stop processing this invoice and let's do a UPWP modification. But yeah, you can do it after the invoice has been processed, as long as that reimbursement that we're giving you, that charge that we're giving you reimbursement for, does not go negative during that invoice period. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Right. So it would impact, having a negative task would impact the next invoice, not the current one. So the current one, if it takes some negative, they still have time to process the amendment until that, but you cannot process another invoice until that amendment goes through.
Correct.
I understand that, but that's not the problem. The problem is, by the time I'm realizing that a task is negative at the end of the year, the time frame of the invoice is 2 months earlier than from when I'm able to process a modification. And I am not allowed to apply a modification that occurred after the time frame of the invoice.
Anybody, Mike, Romero, any insight?
So I don't believe it's that you're not able to process the modification after, because the expectation is any work that you have done, we expect that it's in the past and you'll be monitoring when you're seeing negatives. You're not really going to know until the service is rendered where your money is falling. And so I believe the issue is if you try to get the reimbursement before you do the modification. So you'd reach out to your MPO liaison.
Yeah, I have not done that. The problem is I'm not allowed to put the new UPWP modification on my invoice where the money is correct and I have budget because the modification was processed after the date time frame of the invoice. And that may be something I need to ask my district about more.
Right, because we've had that issue with our MPOs where they're starting to have an overage, if that's the correct word, on a particular task that's starting to show up as a negative. They reach out to us, we advise that, okay, you need to process your revision at that time. And once that revision has been reviewed by us and FHWA, FTA, then we get the approval, and now you're given the approval to submit an invoice for that time frame, because now we have done adjustments to your budget to allow you to bill for that past time frame. So I'm not sure if it's just a rule with your particular district, but
yeah, I didn't used to have the problem, but it seems that has occurred, come up in the last few years that that's no longer allowed. I have to predict far in advance, at least a couple months, if a task is going to go negative on a particular line item, which makes it very difficult towards the end of the second fiscal year.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, because we're aware that it's sometimes difficult to predict. For example, we went through the whole experience of the pandemic, so there had to have been some adjustments to what was going on at the time. You couldn't anticipate that, and you may have to overexpend in a certain item or task on your UPWP. So that's why I'd say you are allowed to, after that time frame, when you see where your budget is falling, to do a revision to correct it.
Okay.
Again, I just want to point out that these are the practices that we have here at District 4.
Right.
Obviously, partner with your district and make sure that the process is the same for them. You know, we try to facilitate and assist the MPOs as much as possible in keeping that budget line correct. But again, your district might have certain practices as well that they require certain policies for the district.
Thank you.
Again, do not hesitate to reach out to your district, and it may be something as a overall statewide group we may discuss and come to a consensus to assist.
Yeah, this is Jennifer. It sounds like central office can help facilitate that discussion to see if this is something that needs to be brought to the attention statewide.
I appreciate the question too. I mean, thank you for asking. This is something that happens with multiple MPOs. So thank you for bringing it up, Laura. Thank you.
Any other questions, by the way, Melissa? No, this, okay. Some further notes with regards to the review, payment, and return of invoicing. In the case where an invoice is incomplete or inaccurate, as we previously mentioned, Section 9H of the MPO agreement outlines the required actions. And this is an excerpt from the MPO agreement. If there is a case of a bona fide dispute, the invoice recorded in FDOT's financial system shall contain a statement of the dispute and authorize payment only in the amount not disputed. If an item is disputed and is not paid, a separate invoice could be submitted requesting reimbursement, or the disputed item or amount could be included or added to a subsequent invoice. If an invoice is incomplete or inaccurate, the district MPO liaison will work with the MPO to correct the issue and receive an updated invoice as soon as possible.
To make a clarification on the MPO agreement, that's your joint participation agreement, your JPA. So MPO FDOT agreement, that's for your UPWP. Just, I know we have a couple new staff members, new people. So just want to, we sometimes use it interchangeable, but MPO agreement is your joint participation agreement.
Is there any other questions with regards to invoicing?
Do you have a, this is Andrew, do you have any best example from a MPO that you prefer, like a, you know, a nice looking clean version or?
I think every MPO is different because of their needs. So I think we try to be as whatever works for the MPO that we're working with is what we would recommend. So what works for one might not work for the other. But I think as long as you have the minimum requirements of your service period, your certain, the way certain tasks are outlined, we can work with our MPOs and say, hey, if this is not working for you, we can brainstorm and make changes to it. But we don't have a preference per se. We just.
Okay, because that one of Carl McKiska on the screen yesterday looked pretty clean. So I don't know. It was, you know, flashed pretty quickly. I'm not sure if that was Pasco County or if that was.
Oh,
was
the screenshot that was the Palm Beach TPAs.
No, it was. I saw Carl McKiska's name on it, so I didn't know.
Oh, yesterday
it's
or
no big deal.
today?
Yeah, yeah. But it was yesterday's. So I didn't know if there's sort of a clean, you know.
Romero, was that
best
something you
practice.
had on your slide?
We can always look at it later. I just
Yeah.
wanted to know.
Any more questions regarding FHWA funds relating to your UPWP?
And I'd also like to advise, you know, the MPOs are free to also communicate with each other if you want to get ideas. As District 4, we don't get to see the other districts and how their invoices are laid out. The most we'd probably see is each other respective MPOs, especially if one of us is absent, we might work on another one. But it's all about how you do your practice, how you want to do things. We will be flexible and assist wherever possible. Once you have the key information, we are fine with it.
I have a question. Does Palm Beach TPA have the signature authority for your joint participation agreement? So whenever there's a UPWP amendment, they also have to amend the JPA, correct?
Correct.
And so is that something that, Valerie, do you have signature authority for that, or do you have to take that to your board?
Sure, I'll answer this, Andrew. So for our resolutions, so our just overall, our EPWP goes to all our committees and board for the full document. And then amendments are only really seen sometimes by TAC and then the board. And then in a resolution, it states that the executive director has the authority to sign off on all the agreements. And so our board only sees the revised UPWP. They don't see like an attached agreement or anything else with that.
Great, thank you.
And Andrew, the examples we had, one of them was the Harlan TPO for the invoice summary, and then the itemized detail report, which you all received this week, that had Pascal will be an example to use. It breaks down all the different tasks and what's going on the subtasks.
Thanks.
One last thing, just to clarify, when you amend the UPWP, you don't have to amend the JPA every time you amend the UPWP, just if the ceiling is being raised.
The UPWP can still be amended. If it's just like UPWP amendments are for budgetary increases, but if you're still moving money between tasks, even though you're not increasing budgetary ceiling, and it meets that amendment threshold, we
you don't have to amend the JPA. Correct.
Not for every type of amendment, no.
Just if you're raising or lowering the ceiling. The
Correct.
ceiling.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
Great questions. Any more? And with that, we will be handing it over to Wibet Hay. She is our multimodal coordinator at our Office of Modal Development in District 4. She'll be discussing the 5305D funds and the CPG.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Zubaid Hay with the Office of Rural Development. And I know, can we go to the next slide, please? I know we don't have a lot. I don't have a lot to discuss, to be honest, because the 5350, 530, I'm sorry, 5307. I'm sorry. Too much numbers. But the 5305D funds are at the end because we did the consolidation of the PL and the 5305D 2 years ago. So my goal right now is to actually get the MPOs to actually utilize the funds that they currently have, spend it down so I can go ahead and close out those grants. So the MPO liaison can take over fully those funding. If you have any questions that we don't go over here, then you can always reach out to me. But the goal is to actually help to reduce the amount of grants that the department currently have. So that way we can streamline the process as best as possible. Next slide. So these are the grants that we currently have and the expiration date. As I mentioned before, the goal is actually to close out all these grants. Now, it's very important that if you have, even though we have the expiration dates of 2025, the sooner we can close these grants out, the better it is for us, because we have these grants straggling out there, and then the MPO liaison have these other monies that they are focusing on. I had a situation last year where, because we were utilizing other funding, some people left some money on the table, which I would prefer not to have to give any money back. So if we can spend down these grants as soon as possible, and so we can close them out, that is fantastic. I'm not, go to the next one, please. I'm not going to go too much into detail as it relates to invoice, because but Maria, Commissioner, well, Maria and Marsha just went over it in great details, but what I wanted to focus on is documentation, as much documentation as you can probably put on those invoices, making sure that these documentation match whatever you're asking for. Make sure it's clear and concise as best as you can, and it needs to provide as much detail. So when we take a look at the documentation, it should reflect what you're requesting on the invoice. As I mentioned before, the funding balances, as if you have money left over on the grant, as I said earlier, please, 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 just make sure we spend it down ASAP so we can go ahead and close out those grants as soon as possible, because I don't want to leave any money on the table. If you have money left over on the grants, and I know we didn't, Marsha and Maria didn't go into details, but we would like you to actually send me an email to say, okay, you know that this is a final billing. Please make sure that you close out the grants. Just because I cannot close a grant if we have $2 or $3 left on the grant. Unfortunately, that's a process that we go through in our department. And that's kind of where we are right now. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. But this is just a smaller part of the presentation. Questions?
I'm sorry. Okay. So I noticed that you had expiration dates on those funds for each MPO. So your closeout date is different. It's not the same as the UPWP.
No.
Okay, so that billing cycle is completely different from.
It is.
Okay. And then you've got the details on the funds for each MPO. They can reach out to you, or you could send
that.
That
is correct. I didn't put the funds on here just because it's open to everyone, and I would like to keep private information private. So if you have any questions on the balance, please reach out to me. I have that amount available for you.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
And for the other districts online, other MPOs, reach out to your coordinator at your respective district.
Okay, thank you.
So we can start the UPWP portion where we'll go over the amendments and modifications, but would say if we could take maybe like a 10-minute break so everybody can just process all the information we gave out, and then we can take some questions regarding the invoicing, and then we'll go into the UPWP. So it's 10 o'clock. We can come back at 10:10. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Okay, good morning, everyone. It's still morning. We're gonna go ahead and start with the UPWP discussion right now. But before I start with my spiel, I want to ask if there's any questions regarding the invoicing before we move forward, or any clarifications needed. No? Okay. If you do have questions at the end, we can always go back at the end and answer those questions. And this material or any references that we use during this training, we will be providing that at the end as well. So next. Okay, so the types of revision that we have during the UPWP, we have amendments and modifications. Amendments may be budgetary, programmatic, or both. So that means that, any minor revisions, they will be processed as a modification if it doesn't fall within those amendments reasonings. That will be increasing your budgetary ceiling, adding or deleting task or subtask, changing the scope of a program or key task, and even change in a key person will be considered an amendment. A key person is identified as your executive director. That will be grounds for a UPWP amendment. The reason being, an executive director being a grounds for an amendment, it's because they're the ones that sign your JPA or your joint participation agreement or your MPO/FDOT agreement. So.
Hi, yes. This kind of goes to a topic that we discussed yesterday, and we are going to be following up with our federal partners to see if it actually requires processing an actual amendment, or if because if it's just your MPO staff director that's changing, kind of working with our federal partners to see if just notification and working with our federal partners so it doesn't have to go through, since nothing's actually changing in the UPWP, it's just the staff directors changing, because that's going to be happening at least for 2 MPOs in the near future around the state. So we are going to kind of follow up on that and work with our federal partners.
Thank you. So the types of UPWP revisions that's listed under section 3.9.1 of the MPO handbook. There's more details on that, and it includes examples of financial and non-financial UPWP amendments and modifications. So again, modifications are UPWP changes that do not fall into the categories of an amendment. And just to go over a couple more categories of an amendment, it can also be sub-awarding, transferring, or contracting any out of the activities in the UPWP. So you might have an activity that's part of your UPWP, whether that's, let's say, a mobility hub project that's there, that you can use planning funds on your PO money. Let's say that project gets awarded a grant. You are able to remove that from your UPWP since you got awarded a grant to cover that task, but we do have to process it as an amendment. Or if you're disengaging from a specific task for more than 3 months, or if it's a 25% reduction in the time devoted to that specific task. Any costs that require prior approval, whether that's capital and equipment purchases greater than 5,000, that's going to require an amendment as well. Any questions?
There is a question online of if there's a threshold for modifications, but you may have just answered that.
So there's a threshold, as we were discussing with the amendment, which is the 10% and 100,000, or
the $100,000 or 10%.
Whichever's more restrictive. So if it's below that, then it will be a modification. Again, there might be, let's say it doesn't meet the 10%, but it meets 100,000 and it's $100,001. Again, it's district discretion whether they want to for that $2 or $1 difference, process an amendment. If it's, in our case, we will just use our discretion and say that might be a modification. So always work with your MPO liaisons and see where they're at. And then if they need further guidance, we do it all the time. We reach out to our federal partners at FHWA, FTA, and even central office. So if there's any questions regarding thresholds that it might be towing the line, just work with your MPO liaison so they can use their best judgment. Yes.
For deleting tasks or subtasks, let's say we have a task that just doesn't get completed over the 2-year time frame, and we've pulled some money out of it, but really just didn't get around to doing that task. It's not really a deletion, but we just never accomplished that task. Is there any problem with not having any sort of work shown over for a deliverable in the UPWP or task?
I believe this has happened previously, and it's my understanding it would be best if you, especially if you get to close out, you provide something in writing explaining why it hasn't happened and what the intent is, if you're going to do it in your next UPWP or not. Just give us something in writing clarifying why it wasn't done.
Great. But it doesn't count as a default deletion of a task.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Any additional questions? Okay, next slide. So this is an example of the documentation that's needed for UPWP revision or amendment. And this is what we like to internally call it the purple form. Before it was the green form, and then it was like a blue form. So we just call it the purple form. It might change colors. We'll change it the color name as well. But this is what's required when you're submitting either a modification or an amendment. And there's a couple things that I want to point out. So for the supporting documentations, it does have it in the form. When you're submitting an amendment, make sure that you're including your task pages, your agency participation budget table, the current and proposed, your fund summary budget table, current and proposed, the signed cost certification. That signed cost certification is signed by the MPO liaison. So we will not sign that until all the modifications or all amendments have been reviewed. And we will provide that to you at the end and include it as part of your signed and approved package. And then you will also include your MPO meeting agenda, or some MPOs have a resolution. We will attach the resolution as well. And then your actual tip modification, just remember your UPWP has a project number. All projects, whether it's planning projects, construction projects, design projects, are required to be on your tip. So your UPWP is also listed in your tip. Make sure that if you're making changes to any of the monetary values of your UPWP, you also do so in your tip, whether that's increasing the budget or decreasing the budget. And then with the amendment, we also do the amended MPO/FDOT agreement, JPA, Joint Participation Agreement. That has to be included for UPWP amendments. For modifications, you're only required to submit your task pages, your budget tables, the current and proposed, for both the agency participation budget tables and your fund summary ones, and the signed cost certification. Since you're not increasing or decreasing budgetary ceiling for UPWP modification, there's no need for a tip modification or for the MPO meeting agenda/resolution.
And one more clarification for the signed cost certification. I'm not sure how the other districts handle it, but for our district, you're not the one providing that form. We would be the ones completing it, and we put it as part of your package when we're submitting to FHWA and FTA for their approval, just to be clear.
The form also has, for the signed cost certification, it'll have the revision that we're currently working on, and it'll have whether it's being modified or amended, or if it's initial adoption, because we also signed the cost certification when we're approving your UPWP. So that's why we say just let the MPO liaison fill it out, because there's certain things we have to select there. And then our actual letterhead might have changed So we ask that you let your MPO liaison take care of the signed cost certification, and then you guys can take care of the other things. Any questions? And then we will be providing this form as well if you know, as part of your presentation package. And then also I do want to make a note. During the invoice processing, we talked about rapid firing or not processing a UPWP amendment and modification at the same time. I just want to reiterate that point that district practice for District 4, not sure how the other districts do it, but we only process a modification or amendment or both one at a time, not at the same time as an invoice. So with that being said, if you guys need any guidance before we process an invoice, if you want to meet with your MPO liaison and say, hey, I'm scared that maybe for this next invoice period, we might have a task that's going to be negatively impacted. We won't have enough budget to cover it. We can do the UPWP modification or amendment, whatever, once we discuss what kind of changes you need to make, and then we can process the invoice. So always communicate with your MPO liaison before submitting an invoice and you're afraid that a task is gonna be going under. So. And then also please know that all amendments and modification must be uploaded into the document portal, but that's going to change to the GAP system once it's up and running. But for right now, we do ask that you upload it in the portal. And then we also ask that when you send it to us to include our federal partners. That includes Erica Thompson from FHWA and Ayers Little from FTA. Next slide. So these are the references that we use for UPWP revisions. Your MPO handbook, section 3.9, pages 3-52 through 3-54 talks about revisions and the types of revisions. And then Tech Memo 22-01 Revision 1 provides directions to the MPOs and the MPOAC in the processing of both modifications and amendments to the UPWP. And then Tech Memo 19-03 is to explain how federal funds, both FHWA and FTA funds, are documented in the UPWP, the TIP and the STIP, and why UPWP amendments will require either a concurrent TIP amendment or TIP modification by the MPO and a STIP modification or amendment by FDOT. Next slide. Your UPWP contract documents. So the district normally enters into a joint participation agreement or MPO agreement or MPO/FDOT agreement with the MPO. This contract is a 2-year contract. It starts July 1st and ends June 30th. The UPWP is considered an exhibit to the JPA, and I put some examples. The one below it is the actual amendment contract that you're going to use. So if we're doing a UPWP amendment and we have to amend the JPA, that's the form we're going to be using. And then the one on the right, that's your actual original MPO agreement. And it has a couple informations that you have to fill out. So any questions regarding this? No? Next slide. I think we can continue on unless you guys want to take a break. No? Okay, no break. So we're going to go over.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are we going to be getting into the template for the tables, the funding tables in the UPWP at all today?
We're not going to go over the template, but we know that because we don't have a set template exactly. I mean, there is one provided by central office that you can use for your UPWP, but some of our MPOs use a different, they use their own, so you're welcome to use your own.
For Mike then, are there any updates to those tables that are coming out, or we're just going to use?
Yeah, so we did add one update to the template, and that's for the obligation.
Okay.
And so that will be on your total summary and a section to show 2 sections. One, just showing what the obligation, and also when you're doing your total balances to show the total amount that's being de-obligated. So we have shared that with our federal partners, and we're just waiting for them to have any comments, and we'll share that with our liaisons and MPO partners as soon as we get that back.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, so we're going to go over the UPWP funds authorization and the process on how we authorize and provide those letters of authorization. This is coming from your MPO handbook, section 3.7.3, and it talks about remaining authorization and encumbrances, if anyone needs that reference. So by June 1st, the PO funds coordinator from central office, that will be Chris Bratton, will email us the district MPO liaison notifying us of each of our MPO's first authorization amount. And that's for your PO money. The district federal aid coordinator cannot request authorization of funds until FHWA and FTA have approved your UPWP. So we're talking about your first letter of authorization. If FHWA and FTA have not approved an MPO's UPWP by June 15, there will not be sufficient time to encumber the funds and issue a letter of authorization to the MPO before June 30th. With that being said, our system, our CFM system closes down some point mid-June every year, and it doesn't open until sometimes like the first week, maybe even later, going into the second week of July. So that's why you need to make sure that all your UPWP is approved before June 15, so that way we can submit authorization so we can encumber those funds so they are ready to use by July 1st. And that will be your 25% of PO funds. And that's why we put it gets allocated, because depending on when your UPWP gets approved, you might not be able to use those funds until they get authorized. So just keep an eye on that. In this case, work performed by the MPO or contracted out by the MPO prior to the letter of authorization date cannot be reimbursed. Once the funds have been authorized, the district MPO liaison can encumber the funds in CFM. That's our certified financial management system. And that's what closes down in mid-June until the first week or two of July. The encumbrance request must be submitted by June 15 to allow sufficient time for CFM's review, processing, and approval before July 1st. Oh, it's contract funds management. My bad, acronyms. The second PO authorization will be provided after October 1st when the official FHWA notice of appropriation is received for the new federal fiscal year. So this is to touch on the presentation that Chris Bratton said that, hey, you won't get that funds exactly October 1st because we have to wait for the federal appropriations to come out. The federal fiscal year starts October 1st. So just be mindful of that. And then the process is similar to the June authorization as well. The central office PO funds coordinator, in this case will be Chris Bratton, will notify us, the district MPO liaison, of the amount for authorization. We will then request our district federal aid coordinator to process the authorization requests. Once the district MPO liaison has been notified that the funds have been authorized, then we need to enter the encumbrance into CFM. CFM will then email us the approval sheet. And then once we receive both the funds approval, we will prepare the letter of authorization and we will send that to the MPO indicating that their PO funds are now ready to use. Any questions regarding that? No?
Yes.
Yes.
If an MPO had deobligated funds to be made available in year one of the new UPWP, are 100% of those funds available July 1st?
For the SU?
Or PL?
For PL? No, so the year one, you get 25% of your PL allocation for that first year. So right now in this current UPWP cycle, it started in fiscal years 23. So July 1st of 2022, you got 25% of your fiscal years 23 PL allocation. Then the remaining 75% you receive sometime after October 1st. Does that answer your question?
It does, but Chris Bratton probably isn't on today, but I would like verification of that from Central Office Work Program.
Maria, what I think maybe Mark is getting at is for the existing UPWP, for the funds that have already been allocated and authorized, they deobligate, say, 50,000. Will that 50,000 be available at the beginning?
July 1, yeah.
July 1 for the new UPWP? And that might be a Chris question.
That might be a Chris Bryant question because it depends on where you are in the closeout process. There's a lot that goes into your closeout. We have to do a lot of notifications internally. And then finally, once those funds are released back into central office plan, PL, I don't want to say box, but bucket, then it has to be listed in your UPWP. And like Chris Bryant was saying yesterday during the presentation, you can't list your deobligated funds until they've been fully released. So in order for them to be approved by July 1st, I would say it has to be already included in your adopted UPWP, the new one.
And the reason I'm asking is because the MPO already had the budget for those funds. And does the budget lapse going into the new year?
We'll coordinate with Chris on that so we can get an answer. Because that's a little bit of a kind of a nuanced question when you're taking funds from one UPWP, deobligating them, moving them into the next 2-year UPWP. So I think we want to make sure we have a good answer before we just, or at least before I just talk off the top of my head.
And then for year 2, it goes through the same process. Your 25% of your PO allocation gets allocated and approved hopefully by July 1st or sometime thereafter for the authorization, because it all depends once the funds get authorized. So your year 2, it's that, I like to think of it as a dashed line. So even if you don't use your full 100% allocation of PL from your first year, you can still use that in your second year. It's that little dash line and between the contract period. And then your 75% will also get allocated by October 1st. Now, if you have any other type of funds like SU funds, because you're in an urban area or you've requested to have that, in order to use SU funds in your UPWP, the MPO must have their UPWP as priority number 1 of their list of priority projects. And just be cognizant, let's say you don't have SU right now, but you wish to add it in the next cycle of your list of priority projects, it gets added to the new 5th year. For District 4, yes, this is District 4. Other districts might be different, but for District 4, it gets added into your new 5th year. And then you will then receive 100% of that SU allocations by July 1st because they're part of your list of priority projects. It's been approved. Now you're going to get whatever was allocated, and then it's going to be part of your UPWP. It's going to be adopted, so you will get the authorization 100% of those funds. And this is also a District 4 longstanding practice that any unused SU will not be deobligated or reobligated for use in your UPWP. Christine did make a point that you can deobligate SU, but it will just go into that SU bucket, and then it can be used to fund other projects. So they will just not be deobligated or reobligated in your UPWP. During the closeout of the old UPWP, the district is cognizant of the 80-20 rule, and we work with central office to ensure that all MPOs are within compliance. Any questions regarding authorizations? No. There we go. Okay, so your UPWP closeout. This is part of your MPO handbook, section 3.8, closeout of FHWA funds. Your UPWP cycle ends June 30th of the second year. Therefore, the contract must be closed out by September 30th. After the MPO submits the final invoice, the district MPO liaison will send a letter to the staff director stating that the FDOT's desire to close out the account and request that the MPO confirms the amounts expended. This letter includes a confirmation form and provides the authorization and level of reimbursement provided to the MPO for the fiscal year. Those two forms, the funds closeout letter and the confirmation form, are available for download from the FDOT procedural document library. So we can, I'm not sure, Mike, if it's part of, if they have a link specifically for our MPOs to be able to access those forms.
They would not be able to access those. We would need the liaisons or reach out to us to
Okay.
provide that form for them.
Okay. Upon receipt of the confirmation letter and form, the MPO must promptly review its financial records. Any discrepancies must be noted and then resolved before signing the confirmation form. The signed confirmation form is then returned to the district, and then after the deobligation request is then returned to the district. Any FHWA funds obligated and unexpected at the end unexpended at the end of the UPWP cycle must be closed out within 90 days of the termination of the grant. So that will be by September 30th. If the MPO believes that they will not be able to submit the final invoice by September 30th, we do request a closeout extension in writing to the district. Now, as it was said by central office yesterday, when you're closing out your UPWP, that closeout extension, it's only valid for 30 days unless you're requesting more than 30 days. So each closeout extension is 30 days. After you submit the deobligation request has been approved, then central office of work program and budget will adjust the MPO's account and increase the MPO's available PO balance by the deobligated funds. The district will be responsible for tracking of non-PO funds provided to the MPO. And that's more like if for SU funds, again, we have a standing practice that if you don't use your SU, you lose it. That's kind of what we go by. Every district might have different guidance of their SU funds. When you are thinking of deobligating any PO funds, we do ask that you also send a request in writing to the MPO liaison stating how much of your PO funds you wish to deobligate. So we're going to go over certain dates to keep in mind as to when you should be submitting a request to deobligate your PO funds. And then the screenshot at the right, it's taken from the MPO handbook, and it's kind of like a snapshot of the closeout process. Next slide. So this is a slide where we have our current UPWP schedule and how it's like where we currently are right now in December, and when we're going to be starting the new UPWP when the current UPWP ends and then the new UPWP begins. So January 2024, we're going to start coordinating with our MPOs on their new UPWP development. During this development, we're going to be providing the MPOs planning emphasis areas. We're still waiting for our federal partners to provide that. Once they get provided to us, we will send it out and share it. We will also be providing your PO balances and most recent estimates available for your FTA planning funds. So as we get that information, that doesn't mean by January 15 or January 10th. As we get it, we will start providing that information to our MPOs. And that even includes your federal aid number. As of right now, there's no changes to it, but if there are any changes, we will be providing that as well. Then March 15, 2024, the MPO needs to notify the district MPO liaison in writing if they intend to unencumber funds from the current UPWP. So that's where we spoke about of the deobligation of your PO funds. By March 15, we would like to have something in writing for you guys to give us an amount of, and this is District 4. This is also guidance from the MPO handbook, but we will, if you know beforehand how much PO you wish to deobligate, the better, because we can communicate that with central office. By April 15, the MPO shall prepare a UPWP amendment with supporting documents and obtain approval as directed by the MPO's public participation plan. And this is if you're deobligating your PO funds, that means you're decreasing your budgetary ceiling. And as we discussed earlier, any decrease or increase in budgetary ceilings for under an amendment. So we will need to have the amended MPO agreement by April 15. MPOs cannot include anticipated or deobligated funds in the draft UPWP. The deobligated funds can only be included in the draft UPWP once an amendment has been processed. So that goes with the development. Your question, you were asking if they were going to be available, is they will be per se, as long as it's been already taken off of your current UPWP and the amendment has been processed and central office gets notification of that, then that can be included as part of your new UPWP for those funds to be available for you to use. By May 15th, we're currently in the new UPWP development. The MPO addresses any district and agencies concerns and adopts the UPWP, signs MPO agreements, and uploads it into the MPO document portal, or by then it'll probably be the GAP system. We do know that MPOs have different board meeting dates, so that April 15 is a guidance. But if your MPO board meets May 20th, May 27th, just work with your MPO liaison. And then I know the liaisons, for example, in our district, will let central office know, hey, our MPO's board is not happening until this date. So the signed UPWP will not be available until this date. Then June 1st, the district adds the UPWP recommendations for approval into the MPO document portal as a comment. And then June 30th is when your current UPWP ends. And then we will also be processing any agreements for your new UPWP. And we will be working on our letters of authorization as well during that cycle. So there's a lot going on in the development of the new UPWP and the ending of the current one right now. And that's why we ask if you know that you're going to be deobligating certain funds to let us know in advance, because during this period, our system also shuts down, our CFM system in the middle of June, and it doesn't reopen till the middle of July. So there's a lot going on during this time period. We ask that you work with your MPO liaisons to make sure that all your funds get approved at a timely manner and any amendments and modifications are processed in due time. The unencumbered or deobligated funds are typically available after October in year one. So let's say you didn't send us because you didn't know how much you were going to have left over. You're still trying to see how much funds your consultants are going to be using. So you do not want to deobligate funds. It'll go through the normal closeout process, but those funds will not be available for use until after October in year one. Year two, my bad. So this is, I wanted to just kind of put this out there for all the MPOs to know. And this is the UPWP development. It's a flow chart. It's very hard to read, but it's in your MPO handbook, section 3.6. If anyone's interested, it goes over the whole timeline. The timeline that was in the previous slide is just kind of in the next upcoming months what we will be doing, but this goes more in depth into the UPWP development and specific things that both the MPOs and the district have to do throughout the process. Yep. Okay, before we move on to the slide, I do want to note that when it comes to your UPWP amendments, be mindful that once your contract or your UPWP ends on June 30th, we cannot process UPWP amendments or modifications. We ask that you give hopefully before June 15th to process any amendments, because that's when we're also processing your new UPWP encumbrances and whatnot. So we just want you guys to be mindful of the time frame of when you want your amendments to be processed. The sooner you know, the better. If you don't know or are unsure, again, coordinate with your MPO liaison and we can help you facilitate that process and work with you on that. Next slide. I'm gonna turn it over for closing remarks to Tony and Christine as well. just to do some final comments. But does anybody have any questions before we close out? I know it was a little fast. Just want to make sure that we're addressing any comments or concerns. Okay.
Okay, the question we have is, can you repeat which system is closed mid-June to mid-July?
That will be our CFM, Contracts Fund Management System. And that's where we process your encumbrances or unencumbrances. And also that's where we process your invoicing. So that's how we pay you.
And just to say for that, those dates do go out early. So if you want to, we'll definitely share those out. That CFM usually send dates out for the whole department and let you know what the timelines and deadlines are to submitting documents and doing encumbrances and negative encumbrances.
And with that, we hand it over to Tony Norat.
So thank you, everyone. Again, as we promised, we were going to make it a short day today. We've got some people who are traveling back. I did want to point out again, if you haven't heard, some of the timelines that we've got. The kickoff for the District 4 LOPP has started already. It started November 3rd and needs to be submitted by March 1st of 2024. The joint certification process is starting as well. So you might have some of us reaching out for additional documents for auditing invoices and whatnot, and just sharing documents to get that process started. And again, if you haven't heard, the UPWP process has started already and should be finalizing by May 1st as well. With that said, I'm going to share our district compass and focuses. So we focus on safety, workforce development, technology, improving communities and resiliency, and maintaining a robust supply chain. And our safety message is arrive alive, don't text and drive. So thank you guys so much. I do want to thank the TPA again. Thank you so much for hosting this event. You guys have put yourself in a wonderful situation. So stepping outside the box, thinking outside the box. And if it wasn't for you guys, this event wouldn't have been created. So I hope you guys took some stuff out of it. Thank you to our central office partners as well. You guys made this happen. Thank you for your support. And I do want to hand it off to Christine real quick.
Thank you, Tony. I just want to make one final comment. Really, if you've taken anything out of this training, kind of two things: communication and education. I firmly believe that everything can be solved. 99% of our problems can be solved if we communicate well with our partners, with one another, and if we're educated on, what the rules are, what we can and can't do. So I appreciate our District 4 MPO liaisons. I'm partial to those folks, but I think they're one of the best in the state. But so thank you all for your commitment to your partners. You are always very in tune with what your partners need and what they do, and very much attention to customer service. This position, they're in a very special position where they don't need to be an expert at anything, but they need to know something about everything. So they're probably one of the only folks within the districts that, really have to know everything about everything that we do, but they don't have to be experts, but they have to, figure out how to get it done. So thank you all very much. Appreciate you attending.
Yeah. Thank you to the team as well. Thank you guys. You did a great job. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Safe drive.
Thank you. Everybody be safe.